West Africa before the silence. A land of empires the world barely remembers. Before the borders were drawn. Before foreign maps renamed the land. West Africa was not a quiet place. It was a region alive with power, movement, and ambition. Empires rose not by accident, but through strategy, control, and an understanding of forces many today barely consider. Subscribe to Chrono's Vault. At the beginning stood the Ghana Empire, an empire that mastered something subtle. It did not rely on endless conquest. It controlled the flow of wealth. Gold moved, salt moved, traders moved. And Ghana stood in between, shaping everything without needing to own everything. Its strength came from position, not noise. Then came the Mali Empire, where power became visible. Wealth was no longer hidden behind systems. It was displayed, carried across deserts, and felt in distant lands. Under figures like Mansa Musa, the empire reached a level of influence so vast that its actions could shift economies far beyond its borders. But Mali was more than gold. It became a center of thought where knowledge began to rival wealth. From there, power expanded into something even larger with the Songhai Empire. This was scale at its peak. Administration, military strength, and control stretched across vast lands. It was an empire that refined what came before it, turning influence into structure, and structure into dominance. But the story does not end with these giants. To the south, the Oyo Empire built strength through a balance of power, where authority was not absolute, but negotiated. Nearby, the Benin Empire created a different kind of legacy, one of order, artistry, and a level of urban planning that challenged how civilization itself is often defined. And beyond them, empires like the Kanem-Bornu Empire endured across centuries, adapting where others collapsed, while later formations like the Sokoto Caliphate reshaped power through belief as much as force. This was not a single story. It was a shifting system where power moved, reformed, and reappeared in new forms. Some controlled trade. Some controlled land. Others controlled ideas. But all of them shaped a world that existed long before it was interrupted. And yet, much of this history is told in fragments. Names without depth. Empires without feeling. Power without understanding. This is where we begin to look closer. Because each of these empires holds something deeper, something often overlooked. Not just what they built, but how they thought, how they controlled, and how they eventually faced decline. We will go into them, one by one, not as distant history, but as living systems of power, choice, and consequence. And when you see them that way, the past stops feeling far away. Ghana Empire, the empire that controlled wealth without owning it before. The rise of famous kings and golden legends. There was a quieter kind of power. The Ghana Empire did not become strong because it had the most gold. It became powerful because it controlled the movement of gold. That's the first thing most people don't fully understand. Gold was everywhere in West Africa, especially in the forests to the south. But Ghana itself sat in a different zone. Closer to the Sahel, it wasn't sitting on endless gold mines the way people imagine. Instead, it positioned itself between two worlds, the gold-producing regions in the south, the salt-rich Sahara in the north. And in between those two, it became the gatekeeper, the hidden system of control. Ghana built its strength on something more subtle than conquest. Every trader who passed through its territory paid taxes. Not once, but often twice. When goods entered, and again when they left. Gold, salt, ivory, slaves, textiles, everything moved under watch. This meant something powerful. Ghana didn't need to chase wealth. Wealth came to Ghana. And as long as trade kept flowing, the empire stayed rich without constantly going to war. The silence around its power. There's something unusual about Ghana compared to later empires. It wasn't loud. You don't hear dramatic stories of endless expansion or legendary battles the same way you do with Mali. Instead, what you find is structure, control, order. The king, often referred to as the Ghana, ruled from a capital that was actually two cities. One for the royal court and traditional religion. One for Muslim traders and scholars. This alone tells you something deeper. Ghana understood difference. It didn't try to force uniformity. It allowed coexistence as long as the system worked. Gold, but untouchable. Another detail many overlook. The king controlled all gold nuggets. Not small dust that still circulated in trade, but large nuggets were reserved for the crown. This wasn't just about wealth, it was about perception. If everyone had access to large gold pieces, gold would lose its mystique. So Ghana controlled the idea of gold, not just the substance. It protected value by limiting visibility. Power without expansion. Unlike later empires, Ghana didn't grow endlessly outward. Its strength came from holding a strategic position and maintaining stability. This made it less aggressive, but also more vulnerable in a different way. Because when trade routes shift, or when pressure comes from outside forces, a system built on control rather than expansion can weaken quickly. What led to its decline? Not one single event, but pressure from many sides. Environmental changes affecting trade routes. The rise of new powers. External attacks, often linked to the Almoravid movement. Internal weakening of control over trade networks. And once trade begins to bypass you, your power fades quietly. Not with a loud fall, but with slow disappearance. Mali Empire. After the quiet control of Ghana faded, something louder rose in its place. The Mali Empire did not just inherit trade routes. It transformed them into a spectacle of power, wealth, and influence that reached far beyond West Africa. This was no longer an empire that simply managed flow. This was an empire that made the world feel its presence. At the center of its rise was a figure who has almost become myth. Mansa Musa, but reducing Mali to just one man misses something deeper. Musa was not the source of Mali's power. He was the moment the world finally noticed it. The systems, the wealth, the structure, all of it already existed before his famous journey. What people often hear is that he was the richest man in history. What they don't always understand is how that wealth functioned. Mali's power rested on gold, but not in the same controlled way Ghana handled it. Mali had direct access to major gold-producing regions. It did not just tax trade, it fed it at the source. This gave it something more dangerous than control. It gave it abundance, and abundance changes behavior. When Mansa Musa made his pilgrimage to Mecca, he carried that abundance with him. Gold was distributed so freely along the way, especially in Cairo, that it disrupted local economies. The value of gold dropped because there was simply too much of it in circulation. That moment reveals something important. Mali's wealth was so vast that when released without restraint, it could distort markets far from its borders. But Mali was not only about wealth. That is where most people stop. And where the real story begins. The empire invested heavily in knowledge. And this is where cities like Timbuktu come into focus. Timbuktu was not just a trading hub. It became a center of learning, attracting scholars, manuscripts, and intellectual exchange from across the Islamic world. This shift matters. It marks the transition from an empire of commerce to an empire of intellect. Wealth was no longer just being accumulated. It was being converted into knowledge, into scholarship, into legacy. Libraries grew. Ideas moved. And influence began to take a different form, quieter, but more lasting. Yet, beneath this brilliance, there was a tension building. An empire fueled by abundance must constantly manage that abundance. Too much wealth, too easily accessible, can weaken discipline. Control becomes harder. Regions grow comfortable. Loyalty becomes tied not to structure, but to prosperity. And when that prosperity begins to fluctuate, so does stability. After the peak of Mansa Musa, the empire did not collapse instantly. It stretched, it held, but slowly the edges began to loosen. Provincial leaders gained more autonomy. Trade routes started to shift. External pressures increased. And like many empires before and after, Mali did not fall because it was weak, but because it could no longer hold together the scale it had reached.